All right, so we're gonna finish up the midterm review. This will be the second part, the final part of it. And so we went over chapters 1 and 2, some key concepts that we want to remember, of course. Now, going over chapter 3, we talked about tissues, right? So there's 4 types of tissues in the body, right? Before we get to tissues, we want to understand at that chemical and molecular level, all the way up to the organ system level, atoms, right? They'll combine to make molecules. Molecules will interact to form cells, right? Cells will combine to form tissues. Tissues combine to form organs, and organs make up organ systems, and organ systems create the organism, right? So there's 4 types of tissues within the human body. There's epithelial tissue, right? That covers the exposed surfaces. Connective tissue that fills our internal spaces, like our packing material, basically. We have muscle tissue that can contract during to produce movement, and we have nervous tissue, right, for communication. So epithelia. So there's 2 types of layering, right, when we're thinking of epithelial tissue, okay? So there's simple epithelium, and simple epithelium, you just have 1 layer of cells, okay? Stratified epithelium, you have 2 or more layers of cells, okay? So stratified is 2 or more layers of cells. So, for example, simple squamous epithelium, that could be found right in that mesothelial lining, right? That pleural, the parietal, and the peritoneal body cavities. And that's just, again, that's 1 cell layer of this squamous shape, okay? But stratified squamous epithelium, right? So stratified squamous epithelium is going to be multiple layers. You can see how there's multiple layers, right? And you're going to find this on the surface of the skin, okay, lining the oral cavity. But remember that stratified squamous epithelium, we can find that in the skin, and there's going to be multiple layers, okay? We have another type of, that special, in a sense, type of epithelium is transitional epithelium, right? And is able to permit the expansion and recoil after stretching. So these epithelium, they can stretch, and then they can return right back to their regular shape, right? Look at that. Okay, see them stretch and then return back into the regular shape, and that's going to be transitional epithelium. And you're going to find this in the urinary system, such as the bladder, the renal pelvis, and the ureters. Okay. Connective tissue, right? So there's types of connective tissue. They're going to be divided into connective tissue proper, right? The packing material of the body. Fluid connective tissue, right? The fluid that's in your body, like your blood and your lymphatic tissue. And then you have supporting connective tissue, right? That's going to be cartilage and bone. Remember, we talked about bone a lot. Bone is a type of connective tissue, okay? That was all chapter 3. Chapter 4, some key things I want you to remember is the epidermis, right? Remember the epidermis, 5 layers, of course, but it's going to be primarily composed of stratified squamous epithelium, right? Stratified squamous epithelium. Excuse me. When we're looking at skin color, right, there's epidermal pigments, right, such as keratin and then melanin, right? Melanin is going to be produced and stored in these melanosomes, right, within the melanocytes, right? These are the cells that create it, okay? Cells that create the melanin. And again, it's going to create that natural skin color and tan, and it's going to protect against UV radiation, right? It's going to be that melanin produced by the melanosomes within that melanocyte, right? That melanocyte, or that melanin cell, right? Going over chapter 5, some stuff in chapter 5, right? Remember we talked about the skeletal system, okay? Now, the skeletal system is going to be divided into 2 divisions. You have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Functions of the skeleton, right? Support is going to provide that framework for the attachment of other organs. It's going to act as mineral storage, right? Storing 98% of the body's calcium, phosphate ions, right? We're able to make blood cells, okay? So your bone marrow will produce these red blood cells, right? And these white blood cells and these platelets, right? These erythrocytes are these red blood cells, okay? And your bone marrow will produce that, okay? Skeletal system also acts as a lever, right, or lever, right, where your muscles pull on bones to produce movement. And it also acts for protection, right? Think of your ribs protecting your heart and your lungs, your skull protecting your brain, right? Your vertebral column protecting your spinal cord, right? Those pelvic bones protecting your reproductive organs, right? So it acts as a major source of protection, right? When we're looking at cells, right, of bone, right, bone cells, right? So let me start with osteoprogenitor cells. All right, osteoprogenitor cells, these are those bone stem cells, right? They will differentiate to form new osteoblasts, right? Osteoblasts are these immature bone cells, and they produce osteoid, right? Which is involved in making the matrix. So these osteoblasts, they make the matrix, okay? And when these osteoblasts are surrounded by enough matrix, they mature and they become osteocytes, right? These are those mature bone cells. And these osteocytes, they simply maintain and monitor the cellular matrix, right? They maintain the protein and mineral content of the matrix, okay? And then we have osteoclasts, right? Osteoclasts, they're going to secrete acids which dissolve bones. I should have mentioned osteoblasts. Osteoblasts build bone. Osteoclasts break bone. Okay? So you want to remember that. Osteocyte, maintain and monitor bone. Okay. Osteoprogenitor cells, these bone stem cells. Okay. So you want to remember that. Okay. Again, osteocytes maintain and monitor bone. Osteoblasts build bone. Osteoprogenitor cells, those bone stem cells. Osteoclasts, they break bone. Okay? Looking at the axial division, we want to remember that the axial division, or the axial skeleton, right, is going to consist of the skull bones, right? So everything in the cranium, basically, right? Consisted of the auditory ossicles, the hyoid, right? The vertebral column, and we have the thoracic cage. That's going to be the axial skeleton, right? The skull bones, the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column.
Moving further, we have...
Okay. Well, let's give it a second. Right? And then we have appendicular skeleton. That's going to consist of the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, and the limbs. Okay?
Moving further, we have sutures, right? So there are the boundaries between skull bones, right? The boundaries between skull bones are going to be these immovable joints called sutures, and they're going to be made up of dense fibrous connective tissue. Okay. You have the lambdoid suture. That's going to be the suture between the occipital bone, right? That bone in the back, posterior, right? That's going to be the suture between the occipital bone and the two parietal bones. And we can notice the two parietal bones are going to be on the most superior surface of the skull. You have the sagittal suture, right? Think of that mid-sagittal cut. That sagittal suture is going to cut like in the middle, right? That's going to be between the two parietal bones. We have the coronal suture, right? Think of that coronal cut, right? That coronal suture is going to be the suture between the frontal bone.
Okay, and then we look at the appendicular division of the skeletal system. That's going to consist, again, of the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, the upper limbs, and the lower limbs. All right, so remember, appendicular skeleton is going to be the girdles and the limbs. Okay? Appendicular skeleton, the girdles, and the limbs. Okay? Looking at joints, right? So we discussed joints. Okay? There are when we are classifying joints based on their function or their range of motion, there are three types, right? There are synarthrotic joints. These are immovable, right? So they're not going to move, right? And you're going to have examples of this in the skull when you have those sutures, right? Like how we discussed that lambdoid suture. That's between the occipital and the parietal bones. You have amphiarthrotic or amphiarthrosis joints. These are slightly movable, right? Slightly movable, right? And an example of that would be a symphysis, such as like the pubic symphysis, okay? And then you have diarthrotic joints or synovial joints. These are freely movable joints. And you have an example right here of the knee, right? So remember these, an example, right? So an example of an immovable joint is going to be a suture. An example of a slightly movable joint, right, is a symphysis, right? And an example of a freely movable joint is your knee, okay? Chapter 9, we went over muscles. So there are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. With cardiac and smooth muscle, they're both involuntary contraction, right? So they happen automatically, right? They're on auto. Skeletal muscles, however, right? Again, they pull on skeletal bones. We have voluntary contraction. Voluntary contraction. What does that mean? We have conscious control over them, right? Remember that we have conscious control. So if I want to get up out of my seat, I can get up voluntarily, right? You don't want to, in a sense, I guess, be able to voluntarily need to push fluids and solids along your digestive tract, right? That just happens automatically, right? You want certain processes to happen automatically, right? But if you don't want to get up, or if you need to sit down, or if you need to move, or something like that, that's going to be the responsibility of a skeletal muscle, right? And that's why we have voluntary contraction, right? And we have conscious control over them, okay? So, skeletal muscles have functions such as producing skeletal movement, maintaining body posture and position, support soft tissues. They regulate the entering and exiting of material. That's why, again, we have that voluntary control, that conscious control, right, over swallowing, defecation, and urination. And we're also able to maintain body temperature because of our skeletal muscles. Remember this, okay? When we're looking at a skeletal muscle, the organ, right? The connective tissue that surrounds the whole muscle organ is the epimysium. Okay? When we go inside this muscle organ, right, we take out a muscle fascicle. Okay? And a muscle fascicle is just simply a bundle of cells. Okay? There's a connective tissue that surrounds that muscle fascicle. That's a perimysium. Okay, and when we look at that muscle fascicle, right, because a muscle fascicle is, again, a bundle of cells. So let's take out a cell, right? Let's take out an actual cell, and then that cell or that fiber, right, is going to be surrounded by the connective tissue called endomysium. Okay. So out to in, right? So gross to microscopic anatomy, we have epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. But you want to remember, the anatomy from micro anatomy to gross anatomy, right? We have endo to peri to epi. Remember, epi is always going to be like on the outside or the outermost, right? Think of your epithelium, right? That's going to be on the outside. Epi is going to be the outside, outermost. Endo means it's going to be on the inside, innermost. Okay? So make sure you remember that. We want to look at myofibrils and myofilaments, right? Now, myofibrils, right, they're going to be made up of protein filaments called myofilaments. Okay? There are going to be two types. You got the thin and the thick filament. what I want you to remember is looking at this image right here. Okay. When we're looking at a muscle cell or muscle fiber, right? Muscle fibers are going to be made up of these myofibrils. Okay, these myofibrils. Myofibrils will be made up of sarcomeres. Okay, it's going to be made up of sarcomeres. Okay, when we're looking at these myofibrils, though, right, they're going to be inside or surrounded by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? And you're going to have this T tubule down here. And I want you to remember what a triad is, right? A triad is the two ends of these cisternae, right here and right here. And is also going to consist of this T tubule right here. Okay? So I want you to remember that. Okay. The drain. Okay. So, thank you. So, when we're looking at this, we want to make sure that we understand this triad, right? So this triad is basically a complex, right? A complex consisting of, you have that one transverse tubule right here, right? That's what the T tubule is. So you have that one transverse tubule, and you have the two terminal cisternae. So this is one terminal cisternae, this is another terminal cisternae. You have the two terminal cisternae. Okay, so that's what this triad is. So remember that, okay, because you're going to see it. Now, looking at a sarcomere, right, the repeating function of a myofibril, right, this contractile unit of this muscle cell, right, we have different bands. That's why we see these muscle cells as being striated, right? We have these bands, right, of these on these sarcomeres. Okay, when we're looking at a sarcomere specifically, I want you to remember this A band. Okay, this A band. What is this A band going to consist of? This A band is going to consist of the H band. It's going to consist of the M line, right? And it's also going to consist of the zone of overlap. Okay, so remember that with the A band, right? So the A band is going to consist of the H band, M line, and zone of overlap. Okay, remember that for the A band. Chapter 10, we talked about muscular system of the axial system, and we talked about muscular system of the appendicular musculature for 11. So the skeletal muscles, similar to like how the skeleton, right, the bones, are going to be divided into axial and appendicular. Axial musculature, this is where we have muscles that position the head in the vertebral column and muscles that move the rib cage. The appendicular musculature, these are where the muscles that will stabilize or move the appendicular skeleton. And remember that your muscles are going to be innervated by nerves. Okay. So one of the muscles that we have discussed is the diaphragm. Right, the diaphragm is that breathing muscle, right, that helps you breathe, right? It's going to be, remember we said muscles are innervated by nerves. The diaphragm is going to be innervated by the phrenic nerve, okay? It's going to be innervated by the phrenic nerve, okay, of that cervical plexus. There are some muscles that make up the rotator cuff, right? So you think of, some sports injuries like a football player, right? Maybe even a baseball player, right? They can have injuries to their shoulder, right? And there's some muscles that make up this rotator cuff, right? Those being the teres minor, the infraspinatus, the supraspinatus, and the subscapularis. Okay, so remember those muscles because they make up the rotator cuff, right? So write it down. Teres minor, right? Infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and subscapularis. Okay, these are the muscles that make up the rotator cuff. Now, muscles that make up the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs, there's going to be some muscles that will extend the arm, right? Muscles that will extend the arm. Okay? And there are going to be your triceps and your acromius muscle. Okay? Right? So muscles that will extend, right? Your elbow. These are going to be the triceps and the acromius. Okay. You have muscles that will extend the knee, right? So you have muscles that will extend the knee. These are those quadricep femoris muscles, right? And these are going to be those vastus muscles and the rectus femoris, right? Again, these muscles, the quadricep muscles, right? They're going to be the vastus intermedius, the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and the rectus femoris, right? These will all help to extend. These are extensors of the knee, right? These three vastus muscles and this rectus femoris muscle, okay? You have muscles that flex the knee, right? So those muscles that flex the knee, that's going to be your hamstring muscles, okay? Over there, that's just your hamstrings, right? So that's going to consist of your biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. Okay? These muscles will help to flex, right? These are flexors of the knee. Okay? And that was your just quick review, okay? It's 2 parts. So this is part 2, part 1 and part 2. I'll upload those for you guys, okay? Have a good day.